The morning sun was barely stretching over the ridgelines of Albemarle County, Virginia, when Raymond Cole stepped off the last bus with a quiet resolve in his step. The town was still yawning awake, bakeries setting out fresh loaves, dog walkers taking their usual laps, but Raymond's world had narrowed to a single goal, standing in the front row to watch his only son graduate from St. Albans College. He walked with purpose but not urgency, his boots worn at the soles, his dark blue marine dress jacket too snug around his broad shoulders, the brass buttons dulled from age and memory. Every thread carried weight, memories of sandstorms, firelight, and silence after gunfire. There had been ceremonies before, but none like this. None that held the same ache in his chest. He moved slowly up the hill toward the auditorium, a modern glass and stone structure perched like a crown above the manicured lawn. Students and families flooded the sidewalks, chattering with balloons, flowers, and gift bags swinging from their arms. Raymond stood out, not just because he was black in a crowd mostly white, but because of his stillness, his deliberate presence, his silence. He didn't carry gifts. He didn't wear a smile. He clutched one thing, a folded card, the edges soft from too many readings. Lucas had written it by hand, in blue ink that had bled just slightly, "Dad, I want you in the front row." Raymond paused just outside the double doors, watching as families posed beneath the school's crest etched in bronze. He waited for no one. He didn't need permission to be here. He'd fought battles far worse than walking into a room full of strangers. Taking a breath that settled deep into his gut, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The buzz of excitement inside the hall was immediate, voices overlapping, camera shutters snapping, the rustle of programs and the low laughter of prideful parents. Raymond's eyes scanned the vast space. The front rows were roped off, labeled with neat silver placards, faculty, honored guests, family of graduates. He knew where he was supposed to be. Lucas had told him in that note. But he also knew what would likely happen. He moved forward, his posture upright, hands clasped behind his back. The jacket creaked slightly with each step. A few heads turned, mostly out of curiosity. An older man in military blues with dark skin and scuffed boots wasn't part of the visual they expected on this bright, polished morning. But he didn't look lost. He looked like he belonged to some deeper part of the world they rarely acknowledged. Near the front, just as he was about to step into the roped section, a young woman in a headset intercepted him. Clipboard clutched tight to her chest, she offered a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, this area is reserved for designated family only," she said, her tone polite but firm. Raymond gave a single nod. "My son's graduating today. Lucas Cole. He asked me to sit in the front row." Without even checking her list, she motioned toward the general seating area. "You'll need to find a seat in the back, please. Or security will assist you." Raymond looked at her for a beat, then at the row where his son had asked him to sit. His grip on the folded card tightened just slightly. But he didn't argue. Didn't plead. He simply nodded again and stepped back. One pace. No more. No less. Two security guards lingered nearby, having noticed the exchange. They didn't approach, but their postures changed, more alert now, watching. The woman in the headset turned without another word and returned to her post. To her, it was resolved. Box checked. Order maintained. Raymond stood still, now beside the glowing red exit sign along the wall, his eyes fixed forward. He didn't glance around. He didn't shift uncomfortably or fidget. He just stood there, hands behind his back, shoulders square, like he was holding formation on a battlefield only he could see. And in some ways, he was. The crowd ebbed around him, mothers adjusting ties, grandparents fumbling with phones, siblings whispering jokes. Nobody paid attention to the man by the wall, except for a woman named Linda Monroe in the fifth row, and 6 men seated just a few chairs down from her. They'd noticed him the moment he walked in. They hadn't stopped watching him since. Linda, a high school English teacher from Roanoke, had arrived early. She wore a spring green dress and held her son's name circled 3 times in the graduation program. She had spent weeks dreaming of this day, but now she found herself staring at a man she didn't know, her instinct stirring. She didn't know why, but something about the way he stood, calm, unmoving, felt heavier than anything happening on that stage. The 6 men a few seats down were quiet. They wore civilian clothes, jeans, polo shirts, sport coats, but everything about their posture said military. One wore a baseball cap pulled low, another had a beard trimmed within regulation, all carried an energy that didn't come from the suburbs. Their eyes never left Raymond. They saw the set of his jaw, the way he carried himself, the tilt of his left shoulder like it had taken too many hits in another life. And they knew. They recognized something the rest of the room couldn't see. On stage, the ceremony began. A booming voice welcomed the crowd, followed by polite applause. The dean made a joke about student loans, and laughter rippled through the room. But Raymond didn't laugh. Linda didn't laugh. The 6 men in row 5 didn't laugh. They watched. Waited. The girl in the headset walked past Raymond again, this time whispering to another staffer. "He's still standing there," she said. "I don't think he's even on the list." The other replied, "Keep an eye on him. He doesn't look like he belongs." That word. Belongs. It sat bitter on Linda's tongue. She didn't know the man's name yet. Didn't know he had once crawled through fire so others could live. But she knew, without question, that he belonged. And someone, somewhere, had made a mistake. A quiet, irreversible mistake. And something in the air, something far deeper than ceremony, had just begun to shift. Shadows move first where dignity is dismissed. But some men carry history in their silence. And when they stand, even in the back of the room, the whole world will eventually turn. Because some seats are earned not by invitation, but by sacrifice. And Raymond Cole had earned that seat. More than anyone else in that room. More than any name on a list. And they just hadn't realized it yet. But they would. They would. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The glass doors at the front of the auditorium opened and closed like clockwork as families poured in, all adorned with excitement, perfume, and pastel colors. Raymond Cole didn't move. He stood in the shadow of the exit sign, unnoticed by most, disregarded by many. There was a kind of invisibility that came not from camouflage, but from the quiet dignity of those who no longer demanded to be seen. And in this crowd full of practiced smiles and buzzing anticipation, Raymond was invisible. He watched the room fill row by row, each family smiling as if the world itself were applauding just for them. But none of that mattered to him. He wasn't here for them. He wasn't even here for recognition. He was here for his son. A group of teenagers ran past, laughing too loud, tripping over each other with cords hanging from cameras and phones. A mother scolded them gently, brushing lint off her husband's lapel. A faculty member hustled toward the stage with a clipboard, barely missing a collision with an usher. It was a blur of sound and motion, and still, Raymond didn't move. The program in his pocket felt heavier than the medals once pinned to his chest. He had memorized its contents anyway. Lucas Cole, Bachelor of Arts, Sociology, Dean's List. His boy. His son. He remembered how Lucas used to ask him about courage when he was 7, about whether real men cried, and what silence meant after the bullet stopped. Raymond had never given elaborate answers. He just showed him through the way he lived. Raymond let his gaze drift over the crowd. He didn't resent them. He didn't judge them for not knowing who he was. How could they? They had no reason to suspect that the man by the wall had ever done anything other than sweep floors or fix engines. They didn't know about the night in Kandahar when he crawled through smoke and flame to reach 5 wounded Marines, dragging each of them one by one out of a collapsing compound, his shoulder torn, lungs burning, prayers bleeding from his mouth. They didn't know because he'd never told them. And he didn't wear his heroism like a badge. He wore it like a scar, deep, silent, and invisible unless you looked close. Across the room, Linda Monroe shifted in her seat. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, the graduation program held like a shield. She kept glancing back toward the exit sign, eyes drawn to the lone figure who stood there like a sentinel. Something about him unsettled her, not in fear but in gravity. He stood like a man who had waited many years to be in that spot and who had accepted, long before arriving, that he might not be welcomed. She could sense the weight in his shoulders, the kind that didn't come from burden but from carrying other people's burdens too long. She turned to the woman seated beside her, a younger staff member with a bright scarf and tablet in her lap, and asked quietly, "Do you know who that man is?" The woman didn't look. She shrugged and said, "Probably someone who wandered in. These events always attract extras." The word pierced Linda deeper than she expected. Extras. Like that man, the man with the pressed but faded uniform, standing alone. Was just background noise. She turned back and studied him again. The line of his jaw. The tilt of his head. His hands, folded like a soldier in attention. There was no chaos in him, no threat, no defiance. Just patience. A dignity so rare it seemed out of place in a room built for applause. A student on the far side of the auditorium dropped his phone, and the crack it made startled half the room. Everyone turned briefly before returning to their conversations. But Raymond didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Linda noticed. So did the men in row 5. The man with the cap leaned forward slightly, whispering something to the one beside him. They didn't look around like the others had. They didn't laugh or react. They kept watching him. Their posture remained military, shoulders square, back straight, eyes sharp. If anyone had taken the time to look at them longer, they might have recognized what they were. But no one had. They blended in too well, except for what their eyes revealed. And right now, all 6 pairs of those eyes were locked on the man by the exit. Raymond felt the stares but didn't return them. He had learned long ago how to stand still even when every nerve screamed to move. He wasn't here to prove anything. He had fought his wars, buried his brothers, and stood silent during folded flag funerals. He had been called back into fire long after others had run. And through it all, he had survived with one promise to himself: when the day came for his son to walk across a stage, no matter where, no matter how far, he would be there. Not in the back, not watching from a screen, but in the front row, because his son had asked him. That mattered more than any ceremony, more than being told no by a girl with a clipboard, more than being ignored by a crowd that couldn't see past his skin or his boots. The lights above the stage began to dim as the ceremony officially began. A voice echoed through the speaker system welcoming faculty, families, and our exceptional graduating class. The audience clapped. Cameras flashed. The dean took the podium and began with a rehearsed joke that drew polite laughter from most. Linda didn't laugh. She couldn't. Not while that man still stood at the back, unseen by the rest, unwelcomed yet unmoved. She watched the expressions of those nearby, saw joy, pride, celebration, but in her chest, there was something else rising. A mixture of unease and indignation, like witnessing a mistake that no one else seemed willing to correct. And somewhere deep within the 5th row, the man in the cap narrowed his eyes and whispered one word under his breath. "Ray." The others heard it. One of them closed his eyes for a brief moment, like saying a prayer or remembering a name carved into stone. They knew. They all knew. And as the dean continued his speech, none of them listened. They were waiting for something else. A signal. A line to cross. Because if the moment came, and they knew it would not sit still. And Raymond? Raymond Cole still stood by the exit sign, the folded card in his coat pocket resting against his heart like a medal that no one else could see. And he would not move. Not until he saw his son walk across that stage. Not until that promise was fulfilled. And the room, still blind to what was unfolding, had no idea that it was already standing in the presence of something far greater than a ceremony. It was standing in the presence of quiet defiance. Of earned honor. Of the kind of man who needed no spotlight, only a seat that should have been his from the beginning. As the crowd settled into their rows and the names of students began to scroll on the screen above the stage in alphabetical anticipation, Raymond Cole took one small step forward. His boots made almost no sound against the polished floor, but he felt the weight of each stride as if marching through deep sand. His eyes were fixed on the row marked by silver signs and thick velvet rope, honored guests. Immediate family. Reserved. Lucas had told him clearly, "Dad, I want you in the front row." It hadn't been a passing comment. It had been a request wrapped in reverence, the kind a son made when he understood what his father had endured to make this day possible. Raymond knew the weight behind those words because he had carried heavier things across battlefields. He approached the roped-off section with a slow, unwavering purpose, his folded invitation tucked neatly in his chest pocket, close to where his medals used to be, before he gave them all away to the families of the men who hadn't made it home. As he reached the aisle, a young woman appeared before him again, the same one from earlier. Her headset was slightly askew now from the flurry of last-minute tasks. She saw him and instinctively stepped in front of him, blocking the path like a checkpoint soldier. "Sir," she began, her voice overly polite, teetering on the edge of impatience, "this area is for designated family only. If you don't have a seat assignment or guest badge, I'll need you to move back." Raymond's eyes remained calm, unmoved. He didn't flinch at her tone. He had heard worse in boot camp. He had seen faces far more hostile in foreign lands. His voice was soft, deliberate, full of gravel and memory. "My son is graduating today. Lucas Cole. He asked me to sit in the front row. Wrote it himself." He reached into the inside of his coat and carefully unfolded the card, revealing the handwriting, still intact despite its wear. "Dad, I want you in the front row." The woman didn't glance at the note. Her eyes skimmed over him instead, at his aged jacket, his dark skin, his worn boots, and dismissed the moment as something inconvenient. "I'm sorry, sir, but without credentials, we can't allow anyone into this section. You'll have to step away." Raymond didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement that he had been heard and refused. With a grace born of years leading men through chaos, he stepped back a single pace and resumed his station beneath the red exit sign. The clipboard girl exhaled with relief, as if she'd completed a difficult task, and walked away without once looking back. Linda Monroe watched it all unfold with her breath caught somewhere in her chest. She leaned forward slightly, as if trying to pull the man closer with her concern. She didn't know his name, but in that moment, she felt the sting of what had just happened like a lash across her own skin. The way he was turned away without thought, without a glance at the card that meant the world. The way the woman in the headset never saw him, not really. It wasn't just disrespect. It was something deeper, more dangerous. A kind of blind dismissal that cut through layers of history and sacrifice without ever acknowledging it had done so. From her peripheral vision, Linda noticed the men in row 5 shift again. One of them had his fists clenched, thumb brushing rhythmically across the knuckles like he was counting down to something. They were dressed for a ceremony, but their bodies spoke the language of combat. Though they said nothing, their silence had mass. It pressed against the air like a storm front waiting for a reason to break. Raymond didn't look at them. He didn't look at anyone. He stood still, posture erect, eyes forward. But inside, a slow ache was rising. Not anger. Not bitterness. Just the deep, gnawing pain of being seen and dismissed in the same breath. Of being asked by your son to share his triumph and being told, without apology, that you didn't belong. He had not come expecting applause. He had not come to be honored. But he had come to be present. And somehow, even that had been denied. The ceremony on stage continued, oblivious to the quiet unraveling at the side of the room. Another student walked across the platform to accept a diploma. Parents clapped. Phones flashed. The dean cracked another practice joke and grinned like he owned the day. The moment passed, but not for Raymond. His fingers gently tapped the card in his coat pocket, a ritual he'd done a dozen times since arriving. It grounded him. Reminded him of why he had come all this way. Of the promise he'd made to himself in a hospital bed years ago, stitched up and silent, vowing to never miss the milestones his own father had missed in his. A pair of staffers walked by, murmuring softly. "That guy's still standing there," one said. "Do we know who he is?" "No," the other replied, dismissive. "If he doesn't have a guest pass, he's not supposed to be anywhere near the front." Raymond heard it. He didn't react. That kind of language, after decades of service, was no longer new. But it still landed heavy. Still carved a small wound in places he thought had already scarred over. He remembered a time when uniforms like his, worn by men who looked like him, were rarely seen on parade grounds, let alone honored for their courage. And here he was, in civilian clothes now, but still carrying the discipline, the pride, the memory of what that uniform had cost. Linda finally turned to the woman beside her again, unable to stay silent. "That man back there, he belongs here more than most of us. Don't you think?" The woman barely looked up. "Look, these things get crowded. Sometimes people just show up. It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. To Raymond. To Linda. And to the 6 men who still hadn't stopped watching him. Back at the wall, Raymond let out a slow, measured breath. He could have walked away. He could have taken the insult and vanished quietly. But that card in his pocket pulsed like a heartbeat, and he stayed. Not out of stubbornness. Out of duty. Out of love. His son had asked him to be there. And come hell or high water, Raymond Cole would stay until Lucas crossed that stage. The crowd kept laughing. The cameras kept clicking. The list of graduates kept scrolling. And the man by the wall, still dismissed, still uninvited, stood straighter than anyone else in the room. And soon, whether they liked it or not, they would all come to see what it meant when a man refused to move. The buzz of celebration inside the auditorium continued to climb, layer upon layer of claps, cheers, and shifting feet. The first few names had already been read aloud, graduates making their way across the stage while camera flashes lit up like miniature fireworks. The dean's voice echoed confidently through the speakers, each line rehearsed, each joke delivered with mechanical timing. Parents craned their necks, clapping loudly for sons and daughters dressed in caps and gowns, while bouquets were passed down aisles like sacred offerings. But in all that motion, Raymond Cole remained perfectly still beneath the glowing exit sign, his hands folded behind his back, his expression unchanged. He had been trained to stand motionless for hours, whether in the sweltering heat of the Middle East or in the downpours of South Asia, and this auditorium, this indifferent crowd, this moment of deliberate exclusion, was no different. He had seen war. He had seen fear. He had seen death stare back at him through smoke and broken walls. This was just another form of battle. A battle of dignity. And Raymond was a soldier of silence. He did not speak. He did not shift. He simply stood with the card pressed to his chest beneath his dress blues, reading the words over and over in his mind like a prayer. "Dad, I want you in the front row." His son's handwriting was shaky but sure, as if he'd written it with emotion he didn't know how to say aloud. Raymond had read it so many times the folds had begun to fray, the ink slightly smudged where he'd thumbed it too hard. But he didn't mind. It reminded him of everything that mattered. Somewhere deeper in the crowd, Linda Monroe couldn't take her eyes off him. Each time she looked away, she found herself pulled back as if gravity had shifted. Her son was set to walk the stage in 15 minutes, yet her thoughts were with the man standing alone, invisible to the fanfare around him. She could feel something coiling inside her, something heavy and old, like shame borrowed from another era. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his history. But she knew enough to recognize that what was happening was wrong. Not far from her, the 6 men in row 5 sat like statues carved from principle. Their bodies were still, but their minds were tracking every motion near Raymond. When the girl in the headset passed by again, whispering to another staffer while glancing sideways toward the exit sign, the tallest among the 6 leaned forward, his hand briefly resting against his knee. His cap hid most of his face, but the hard line of his jaw made one thing clear: he was watching, and he wasn't going to stay seated forever. Raymond remained quiet, even as the ceremony marched on. He had not come to make a scene. He had not come to be recognized. He had come to see his boy. But that didn't mean he didn't feel it, the sting of being sidelined, of being handled like a threat, like clutter. His jacket, though clean and pressed, had seen better years. Its shoulders were loose from wear, its cuffs frayed from age. He had worn it anyway, because it was the only formal thing he owned, and because it was once something sacred. It carried memories sewn into every stitch, reminders of friends lost, promises made, and the night he carried Corporal Hastings across a mile of desert under sniper fire, whispering psalms just to keep his own mind steady. He blinked slowly and looked toward the stage again. Students lined up in their rows, adjusting caps, nudging one another, hearts thumping in time with the music playing faintly in the background. He could see Lucas among them, his son tall and lean, nerves visible even from this distance. Raymond smiled faintly. He had raised that boy alone. He'd held him through midnight fevers, read him stories until he fell asleep, worked double shifts at the auto garage just to afford one more year of school clothes. He had missed birthdays when deployment came too fast, but he never missed the look in his son's eyes when he came back through the door. That look of relief. Of love. Of home. And now, on the biggest day of Lucas's life, Raymond had been pushed to the margins, turned away by someone who hadn't even asked for his name. A voice nearby whispered, "He's still standing there." Another answered, "He's not going to leave, is he?" Raymond heard them, but didn't move. He had made up his mind long before stepping into the auditorium. He would not be the one to walk away. Not this time. He had walked away from too many things already: fallen friends, medals he didn't care to collect, recognition that came too late. But he would not walk away from his son. In the 5th row, one of the men leaned toward the aisle, shoulders flexing slightly beneath his blazer. He murmured to the others, his voice so low only they could hear. "If they put hands on him, we move." Heads nodded in silent agreement. There was no bravado in their words. Only conviction. They were men who had fought under Raymond's command in places no map ever cared to name. Men who had heard his voice in the fire, who had followed him when others faltered, and who had come home because he refused to let them die. They owed him more than loyalty. They owed him their lives. Linda finally turned to the woman next to her again, her voice brittle with frustration. "Do you see what's happening? That man didn't come for attention. He came for his son." The woman looked uncomfortable now, fiddling with her scarf, her voice hesitant. "It's not up to us. He didn't have a guest pass. What else were they supposed to do?" Linda's answer was quiet but sharp. "See him." On stage, the student speaker stepped forward, a young man with perfectly parted hair and a polished suit that looked like it belonged to someone twice his age. According to the program, he was the dean's son. His speech began with the expected thanks: parents, faculty, friends. But then he paused and smiled a little too long. "And a special thanks," he added with a chuckle, "to the presentable families sitting up front, reminding us what real college values look like." Laughter bubbled up from some corners of the room, light and oblivious. Linda didn't laugh. The men in row 5 didn't laugh. Raymond didn't blink. But in that moment, something deep inside Linda snapped. She turned fully toward the back of the auditorium and looked straight at the man who had stood silently through it all. He had not come to make noise. But maybe it was time someone else did. Because Raymond Cole wasn't invisible. Not anymore. The sound of laughter from the dean's son's remark still lingered faintly in the auditorium, clinging to the air like the last wisps of smoke from a dying fire. Most in the crowd had taken it as a light joke, an innocent jab at the formality of the front-row families. But for a few, the words landed with a dull thud, like a fist gently striking a closed casket. Linda Monroe felt it in her chest, a pang sharp and sudden. She turned her head again, letting her eyes find the tall man in the marine dress jacket, still standing beneath the red exit sign, still unmoved, still unseen. The insult hadn't been directed at him by name, but it might as well have been. His silence echoed louder than the laughter ever could. In the 5th row, just to Linda's right, the 6 men sat rigid, their attention no longer fixed on the stage. The one at the end of the row with the closely cropped haircut leaned slightly forward, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers intertwined as if praying. The joke had flicked something in him, lit a match that had been waiting for a spark. He exchanged a quick glance with the man seated beside him, a darker-skinned vet with a thick beard and a quiet fire in his eyes. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. In silence, they agreed, something had shifted. The man in the baseball cap pulled it a little lower, not out of shame, but out of muscle memory. He had worn that same cap through firefights and storm briefings, through burials and homecomings. It didn't shield his face. It sharpened his focus. He tilted his chin toward the exit sign and nodded once. 4 of the others responded with the same silent gesture. The 6th, the youngest of them, barely more than 30, swallowed hard. His jaw tensed as he whispered, "You think he heard that?" "He heard it," the man in the cap replied. "But he won't show it. That's not what he does." They all looked toward the back of the room again, where Raymond Cole remained as still as a monument. To most, he was just a man out of place. But to them, he was something more. He was the reason they had walked off helicopters alive. He was the man who had held his position when bullets rained like steel hail, who had told them to keep moving when fear tried to root them to the ground. He had stared into chaos and not only survived it, but carried others out of it. He had done so quietly, without fanfare, without asking for praise. That man didn't flinch for medals. He flinched when men he loved didn't make it home. And now, here he was, just trying to sit in a chair to watch his son graduate. Denied entry. Ignored. Targeted like a security risk because he didn't wear the right name badge or the right smile. The irony cut like glass. A man who had stood between enemies and his country for 2 decades, now standing like a trespasser in a building funded by the same flag he defended. Linda couldn't stop watching him either. She didn't know his story, not in detail, but the outlines were clear enough for her to fill in. She saw the fatigue in his posture, not of the body but of the soul. The quiet kind of weariness that came from being unseen one too many times. And she wondered, not for the first time that morning, how many people like him had been erased without anyone noticing. How many had slipped through the cracks because no one ever thought to ask their names. On stage, the program rolled forward with polished enthusiasm. Names were read. Applause followed. Students walked across the stage in waves, their tassels swaying like metronomes, their families rising from their seats to cheer, to capture the moment. It was a beautiful thing, this ritual of success. But for Raymond, standing off to the side, it was also a test of endurance. Every graduate called before Lucas meant he was closer to the moment he had come for. Every second was a second longer without a chair. Without a place to belong. The woman in the headset passed by again, this time speaking into her microphone, murmuring into the ear of another usher near the front. Their eyes darted back toward the exit sign, brows furrowed in concern. She gestured subtly toward Raymond, then toward the guards. Linda saw it happen. So did the men in row 5. Tension rippled like wine through tall grass. One of the men cracked his knuckles quietly. Another rolled his shoulders. "He's been standing for over an hour," the man in the cap whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "And not one person's asked him his name." The youngest of the group whispered back, "What if they try to move him?" The man in the cap didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and tapped something small and metal, a coin, a badge, something heavy with meaning. Then he said quietly, "Then they'll learn who they're dealing with." The stage lights shifted slightly as the next group of names began. The room leaned forward, inching closer to Lucas's turn. Raymond did not shift his weight. He stood as though time itself had to earn his movement. As though nothing, no rejection, no dismissal, could sway his focus from the task at hand. Linda's heart beat faster, her palms damp against the program in her lap. She turned again, this time fully facing the back of the room. It was time someone noticed. Really noticed. She couldn't be the only one, not anymore. The man by the wall had earned his seat. Not by bloodline or donation or printed invitation. He had earned it the way few ever did, with sacrifice and silence. And he would not demand it. He never would. But someone, somewhere in that room, needed to. And in the row just behind Linda, 6 men who knew what real honor looked like waited, ready to make sure that when the time came, they would stand. Not in protest. In respect. Linda Monroe didn't consider herself someone who picked fights. She had always been steady, composed, the kind of teacher who could calm a room of restless teenagers with nothing more than a glance. She had attended enough graduations to know the rhythm, the traditions, the choreography of applause and photo flashes and prescripted speeches. But nothing about this morning felt rehearsed. Something deeper was moving beneath the surface of it all, something raw and unspoken. And it centered on the man standing silently beneath the exit sign, his marine dress jacket absorbing the indifference around him like fabric soaked in rain. She had first noticed him when she entered the auditorium, tall and still in the corner of her eye, like a landmark in a familiar landscape that didn't quite fit. He wasn't moving. He wasn't talking. But he was there. Rooted. Now, an hour later, he hadn't shifted once. The same posture. The same folded card hidden beneath the folds of his jacket. The same calm expression hiding whatever storm stirred behind his eyes. Linda glanced again at the program in her hands. Her son's name was listed near the end of the second column, under honors. She had circled it with a pen. But now her eyes didn't linger there. Instead, she studied the silver nameplates that designated who belonged in the first 3 rows. She read them carefully. Dr. and Mrs. Hendricks. Family of Chancellor Whitmore. Mr. and Mrs. Tillman, donors. The names glittered under soft light. None of them said, "Father of Lucas Cole." She looked up again and followed her instincts. Something about the man's presence resonated deeper than logic. She turned slightly to the woman sitting beside her, who wore a name badge identifying her as a faculty coordinator. "Do you know who that man is?" Linda asked quietly. The woman glanced toward the back of the room, her expression dismissive. Probably someone who wandered into the wrong section. These ceremonies always bring extras. Linda felt her stomach turn at that word again. Extras. As if the man had no narrative of his own, no arc worth being seen. As if he were just background noise against a well-orchestrated production. Her lips pressed together. The man standing alone had more presence than half the people seated in the reserved rows. He had earned that space, even if no one here remembered how. She turned back and stared at him, truly studied him. She saw the tension in his stance, not of aggression but of endurance. The small tilt of his left shoulder, the way he kept his back perfectly straight. His boots, though clean, had the creases of distance traveled, places visited that most people in this room couldn't imagine. His hands stayed folded neatly behind him, fingers interlaced in a way that looked trained, disciplined. This wasn't a man who wandered in. This was a man who knew exactly where he needed to be, and had been told, with subtle cruelty, that he wasn't wanted there. She watched as another usher passed by him, whispering into her headset, casting a furtive glance over her shoulder like he was a piece of furniture left in the wrong place. One of the security guards from earlier stood now just off to the side, arms crossed, his eyes fixed in Raymond's direction. Linda's pulse quickened. Something was building. Not in volume, but in pressure. The air felt heavy. Raymond didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He was still watching the stage. Names were still being read, applause still erupting every few seconds. But his focus never wavered. He wasn't waiting for a cue. He was waiting for his son. And he wasn't going to move until he saw him walk that stage. In the row behind Linda, the 6 men remained still but alert. She could feel them now, feel the silence that hummed from them like a current. It wasn't passive. It was charged. She turned slightly, her gaze brushing over them. Their faces were sharp with memory. Their shoulders bore the quiet weight of knowing things most people prayed never to experience. She realized they weren't just watching the man by the wall. They were waiting. Anticipating. Preparing. Linda inhaled slowly. She looked again at the front rows. Perfect hair. Polished suits. Sequin dresses and tailored jackets. Expensive perfume hung in the air like a shield. They looked the part of distinguished guests. But the man who had stood against death now stood beside a fire exit, ignored by people who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the kind of place he had once called his workplace. A soft breeze drifted in through a side vent. The auditorium lights dimmed briefly as the screen shifted to another slideshow of student memories. Laughter trickled through the audience. Linda looked away from the screen. She had no interest in the photo montage. She was too focused on the slow, unfolding injustice happening a few feet away. She saw the moment the second security guard moved. It was subtle, just a shift in stance, then a slow step forward. The girl in the headset made a slight motion with her fingers. Linda felt the hairs rise on the back of her neck. She wasn't the only one. The men in the 5th row noticed too. 2 of them leaned slightly forward, not in alarm, but in readiness. Raymond still hadn't moved. He remained in that same solid pose, that same watchful silence. But Linda could see now that it wasn't stillness out of uncertainty. It was something else. A form of protest without words. A declaration spoken through poise. He was saying, I will not cause trouble, but I will not disappear. I will not demand, but I will not back down. She turned toward the stage again, trying to gauge how close the program was to Lucas's name. It couldn't be long now. And if something happened before that boy walked across the stage, if they tried to escort his father out like a threat, there would be no fixing it. No undoing what that would mean. Not just to Raymond, but to every quiet man who had ever been told he wasn't enough. To every sacrifice dismissed by formality. To every soul who came home changed and was greeted only by a wall of silence. Linda looked at the woman beside her and opened her mouth to speak, but stopped. No one else would act. No one else would see. So maybe it had to be her. She stood slowly, adjusting the hem of her dress, and took one deep breath. She didn't know what she would say. She didn't even know if she had the words. But someone had to break the pattern. And as she turned to face the aisle, a chair scraped behind her. Then another. Then 4 more. The sound was small, but it split the room like a lightning strike. Linda turned around. And saw 6 men rise as one. The student speaker adjusted the microphone and smiled into the crowd, perfectly poised and self-assured. He was everything the brochures promised, confident, articulate, polished in a suit that probably cost more than most families' monthly mortgage. The auditorium had quieted into a respectful stillness, the kind of silence that carried an expectation of charm and applause. Linda Monroe sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clenched together in her lap. She tried to listen, to pretend this moment was like every other graduation she had attended. But her eyes kept drifting back to the man standing under the exit sign, still motionless, still unseen by most. The words in the speaker's mouth floated like polished marbles, bouncing softly across the room. The young man thanked the faculty, the administration, and his classmates with perfect cadence. He paused for laughter in the right places, offered scripted emotion where it fit best. Then he lifted his eyes toward the front rows, the elite section with the crisp name tags and floral corsages. With a practiced smirk, he added, and a special thanks to the presentable families sitting right here in the front, reminding us what real college values look like. The laughter came quickly. Polite, restrained, but real. A ripple through the reserved rows, a few chuckles from the sides, even a nod from the dean seated just off stage. The line had been delivered like a joke, meant to be charming. But to Linda, it was a slap. Her face didn't change, but her heart reacted like someone had poured ice water into her chest. She turned slowly to look toward the exit sign again. Raymond had not moved. His posture didn't shift. But there was something different now. An invisible tension tightening around him like wire pulled too taut. He had heard the line. He had heard the laughter. But true to form, he had given them nothing in return. In the fifth row, the men reacted differently. The man in the cap leaned forward abruptly, his forearms resting on his knees, eyes locked on the speaker. The youngest among them clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Another shook his head once, murmuring, "That was for him." The others nodded in silent agreement. None of them spoke further. They didn't need to. The damage had already been done. To the rest of the auditorium, it had been a harmless comment. No names. No direct insult. But the implications dripped with something heavier than sarcasm. That man, Raymond Cole, had shown up in faded blues and worn boots. He didn't fit the aesthetic. He didn't look like the donors or the polished grandparents or the carefully curated alumni. He looked like history. Like pain. Like the parts of the country people celebrated on paper but ignored in person. And now, in front of a room full of strangers, that history had been laughed at. Raymond blinked once, slowly. He didn't look away from the stage. He didn't react outwardly. But inside, something had shifted. He had fought battles against men who tried to kill him. He had buried brothers who died with his name on their lips. He had lived through fire and silence and all the aching in between. But nothing in all those years hit quite the same as hearing his son's invitation dismissed by implication. Not with a bullet, but with a punchline. Linda sat frozen. She felt it too, like guilt that didn't belong to her but had settled on her shoulders anyway. She looked around. Most people were smiling, nodding, leaning in to hear the rest of the speech. No one had caught what she had. Or maybe they had, and just didn't care. She glanced back toward the fifth row. The men there weren't smiling. They weren't pretending. Their faces had gone cold, measured, resolved. The speaker finished his remarks, stepping away from the podium to a soft round of applause. He bowed slightly, confident and unbothered. As he walked back to his seat, he passed by the dean, who clapped him on the back with a proud grin. Linda turned her gaze once more toward the exit sign. Raymond hadn't moved an inch. The card still rested in his coat, the same way it had since he walked in. But now his expression had hardened slightly. Not in anger. In restraint. The kind that took more strength than most people would ever understand. One of the security guards glanced toward the front, exchanging a look with the usher who had first stopped Raymond. She gave a tiny nod. The guard began walking slowly along the wall, his eyes trained on the man in the dress blues. Linda's breath caught. She knew what was coming. They were going to try again. Try to remove him. Try to erase the discomfort they couldn't name. She turned her head slightly, searching the row behind her. The 6 men were watching too. One of them whispered, "Not yet." But their bodies had tensed like coiled wire. Linda looked back toward Raymond. She watched his eyes. They didn't move from the stage, but they had changed. They no longer held just patience. They held something deeper, something steadier. The kind of focus that comes only when someone is standing on the edge of being broken, and decides not to fall. He didn't step forward. He didn't speak. He just stood, because he knew the truth of that folded card. And he knew, no matter how they looked at him, that he belonged. The moment lingered longer than it should have. The guard slowed as he approached, hesitating slightly. Something in Raymond's presence made movement feel heavier. The air had grown still. Even the stage seemed quieter than it had moments before. Linda leaned forward, not realizing she'd held her breath. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her dress. Then, without a word, Raymond took a single step back, placing himself once again against the wall, offering nothing but his stillness. The guard looked at him, said nothing, and stopped walking. Linda blinked. The man hadn't argued. Hadn't protested. But somehow, in that stillness, he had drawn a line. It said everything the words hadn't. I am not a threat. I am not going anywhere. I am not asking. I am staying. She turned to the woman beside her once more, the one who had called him an extra. But this time she didn't ask a question. She simply said, "That man's name is going to mean something before this day is over." And for the first time all morning, the woman beside her had nothing to say. The auditorium buzzed with polite applause as the student speaker returned to his seat, flashing a satisfied grin to the front row dignitaries who nodded in approval. On stage, the dean stepped up again, clearing his throat into the microphone, his voice now smoother, more rehearsed than before. He was unaware, or perhaps unwilling to be aware, of the tension silently building in the wings of the room, where words had just pierced the dignity of a man who had never asked for attention but had been given a reason to stay anyway. Raymond Cole remained in his post beneath the red exit sign, hands still folded behind his back, the same unreadable expression on his face. But inside, he had felt the words dig deep, not like a dagger, but like a shovel scraping over a buried wound. He didn't let it show. The soldier in him had trained for moments like this, not of physical danger, but of emotional endurance. He had stood guard in foreign cities surrounded by enemies and still smiled when a letter from home arrived. He had been overlooked before. He had been disregarded before. But today was supposed to be different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a graduation, his son's graduation, and still, he found himself fighting to exist in a space meant to celebrate family. A different usher approached him this time, clipboard in hand, his suit tighter and his expression more officious than the girl before him. He stopped a few feet away and gestured toward the back of the auditorium. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you again to return to the general seating area. This section is reserved, and we've already explained the policy." Raymond didn't respond right away. He looked past the usher, toward the stage, where another name had just been called and a graduate strode across to receive his diploma. The applause rippled like wine through a wheat field, light and directionless. Only when the noise settled did Raymond speak, his voice calm and measured. "My son wrote me a note. Asked me to sit in the front row. That's where I intended to be. I'm not here to cause trouble." The usher's eyes flicked toward the pocket in Raymond's jacket as if expecting a bomb instead of a card. "Sir, that may be, but we have procedures. If your name wasn't registered for the reserved section, I can't allow you to remain standing here. Raymond slowly reached into his jacket and retrieved the card, unfolding it with quiet reverence. His hands moved carefully, like he was handling something sacred. He held it out between them, not offering it directly, but presenting it with meaning. He wrote this to me by hand. It's all I've got. The usher didn't lean forward. He didn't read the message. Instead, he sighed, straightened, and repeated himself. Without a badge or official placement, there's nothing I can do. Please, sir. You need to move or we'll have to escort you out. Raymond inhaled through his nose, then nodded. There was no anger in his face. Only resolve. I won't interfere with anything. I just want to see him walk. I won't move until I do. That was when the guard arrived again, this time standing beside the usher. Bigger, younger, sharper. He had the stance of someone used to being obeyed. Sir, he said in a voice louder than necessary, you've been asked to move twice. I need you to cooperate. We don't want to escalate this. Linda Monroe had seen enough. She rose from her seat as quietly as possible, hoping not to draw attention but unable to remain still. She turned slightly to face the aisle and caught the moment when one of the 6 men in row 5 tilted his head toward the scene unfolding at the wall. Another leaned forward, whispering something. Then the man at the end of the row stood slowly, his chair creaking against the floor. The rest followed, as if rehearsed, 6 men standing in unison, not in defiance but in purpose. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The air around them shifted. Some in the audience turned to look, confused by the sudden movement. Others remained focused on the stage, oblivious to the line being drawn in silence just steps away from where honor stood forgotten. The man in the cap walked first, his steps slow but certain. He moved with the kind of grace that only came from living through things no one should see. The gold and silver badge he drew from his pocket glinted beneath the auditorium lights. As he reached Raymond's side, he held the badge up, not to the usher, not to the crowd, but to the truth that had just been stepped on. Linda could barely breathe. She saw the badge clearly now. A Navy SEAL trident. The symbol of warriors who had trained, fought, and bled together in ways most people would never understand. This man doesn't leave this room, the SEAL said, his voice deep and level, louder now so the surrounding seats could hear. He led us through hell. He stays right here. The usher blinked, stunned. The guard looked between the badge and the men behind the speaker. All 6 had now formed a line beside Raymond, flanking him without touching him, without saying anything more. Raymond's posture hadn't changed, but something in his face relaxed slightly, like the edge of tension had been dulled by an unspoken acknowledgement. People around them were starting to notice now. Phones were lowered. Conversations paused. The atmosphere was shifting, not violently, but steadily, like gravity reasserting itself. Linda felt her throat tighten. She saw the faces of the families in the front rows turn slowly, confusion giving way to realization. She turned back to Raymond. He hadn't demanded this. He hadn't asked anyone to stand for him. But 6 men had done so anyway. The usher stepped back without a word. The guard followed, hands at his sides. The scene didn't end in confrontation. It ended in clarity. Raymond lowered his eyes briefly, then looked toward the stage again. The card remained in his hand, open now, the words facing up. He didn't smile. He didn't boast. He just remained still. And somewhere in that silence, the room began to understand that the man they had tried to ignore had never once needed to speak. Because real presence doesn't ask to be recognized. It simply waits until the world catches up. The atmosphere in the auditorium had changed. It wasn't loud, not yet, but something unspoken had rippled through the rows like a signal passed between people who didn't realize they were listening. A moment ago, it had been a celebration confined to stage lights and scripted applause. Now, eyes turned toward the side wall, toward a man who had stood quietly through dismissal and insult and who now stood surrounded not by ceremony, but by those who remembered the sound of his voice in fire. Raymond Cole didn't move. He hadn't changed position since arriving, his hands still folded behind his back, his coat still pressed as best he could manage, though the cuffs were frayed, the shoulders worn from years of careful folding. The only thing he had pulled from his pocket was the card. It lay gently in his left hand, unfolded now, the creases soft and broken like skin aged by labor. The ink had faded in spots, the way ballpoint pens do when they've been read over and over, the paper held too long. Linda Monroe couldn't take her eyes off it. From where she sat, she could barely make out the handwriting, but she didn't need to read the words to know what they meant. She had seen his lips move once as he reread the line, and the silence that followed struck her deeper than any speech. "Dad, I want you in the front row." A sentence that could have fit on a napkin. A sentence that had carried him across miles. That had kept him standing when others tried to push him aside. A sentence that reminded him why he had fought to stay still. One of the younger ushers walked up to the older staff member who had previously tried to move him. They spoke in low tones, glancing back toward Raymond and the 6 seals beside him. The older woman shook her head. "He doesn't have clearance," she whispered sharply. "We gave him a chance to sit elsewhere. This is on him." The younger usher hesitated, his eyes caught between doubt and duty, then stepped back without saying a word. The guards hadn't moved since the seals arrived. They stood to the side now, their posture less firm, their presence hollow. They knew better. They had recognized the change in tone when the trident badge appeared. They weren't dealing with a man sneaking into a ceremony. They were dealing with a man who had led others through Death's Valley and never asked for a parade in return. Raymond took a breath and shifted his weight slightly. It was the first motion he had made in nearly half an hour. His boots made the softest sound against the floor. Linda noticed. The men beside him noticed. He looked toward the stage, then downward at the card, then back up again. The card trembled faintly in his fingers. Not from fear. From memory. From restraint. From everything he wanted to say but didn't. He thought of Lucas as a boy, no taller than his hip, holding his hand at the school gates and looking up with eyes too serious for a child. Raymond had missed birthdays, he had missed holidays, he had missed entire seasons of his son's life while deployed. But when he returned, he always brought stories, souvenirs, and quiet discipline. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. His presence was enough. That was the way Lucas grew up, knowing his father was a man who never asked for recognition, but who always showed up when it mattered. And now Lucas had written the one sentence that undid every wall Raymond had ever built around himself. Not "Dad, can you come to graduation?" Not "It would be nice if you were there." But "I want you in the front row." There was no ambiguity in that request. It wasn't about being seen by others. It was about being seen by his son. Raymond turned the card slightly, holding it with both hands now. He didn't wipe the tears that had dried along the top edge weeks ago when he first received it in the mail. He didn't smooth the creases. He didn't have to. Every fold was part of the story. Every smudge, every fading letter, proof of a promise between a father and son. He thought about leaving when they first denied him entry. About taking the bus back to Richmond, quietly, without a word. He had imagined standing outside the gate, watching from a distance, waving to Lucas across the field. But that wasn't what the card asked of him. That wasn't what Lucas needed. And so, Raymond had stayed. He had stood when they told him to move. He had remained silent when others laughed. And when the guards approached, he had not raised his voice. He had simply held onto the card like it was a medal that no one else could pin. Linda swallowed hard. She wanted to walk to him, to stand beside him, to say something that might carry the weight his presence already did. But she stayed where she was, knowing this wasn't her moment to interrupt. It was his to finish. Her job now was to witness. To make sure that when people asked what happened that day, she could say without hesitation that she had seen the truth before it was explained. Another name echoed from the stage. A round of applause. A pause. The dean stepped forward to announce the final group of graduates. Raymond looked down the line. His son was near the end. He could feel it. He always knew when Lucas was close, even before he saw him. There was a rhythm to the bond between father and son that didn't require vision to recognize. The auditorium lights dimmed again, briefly, signaling the approach of the final act. The room began to stir, the front row families adjusting themselves, straightening ties, checking the battery on their phones. Linda kept her eyes on Raymond. She had seen 100 stories walk across that stage, but she had never seen a man write one from the back of the room simply by refusing to vanish. He didn't shift. He didn't speak. But with every breath, he held on to that card like it was the only thing that could still connect him to the one person who mattered. And it was. And it would. The sound of a single chair scraping across the polished floor echoed in the hush like a stone skipping across still water. It was sharp and deliberate, unexpected in a room designed for control and ceremony. All eyes that had been focused on the stage turned, hesitating in confusion, then widening in realization. A second chair moved. Then a third. Within seconds, 6 chairs stood empty in the 5th row, their occupants now upright, shoulder to shoulder, forming a silent wall between the audience and the man still standing beneath the red exit sign. They did not speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was declaration enough. Each of them had served under Raymond Cole. Each of them had faced death with him. And now, without fanfare or command, they stood again, not as a gesture of protest, but as an embodiment of reverence. The first to rise was the man with the close-cropped hair and steady eyes, the same man who had whispered earlier, that was for him. He stepped into the aisle and walked slowly toward the back of the auditorium, his badge held loosely in one hand. It caught the light as he moved, gleaming gold and silver. A Navy SEAL trident. It needed no explanation. People recognized it as soon as it came into view. Whispers began to stir through the crowd. One by one, the remaining 5 followed him, falling into line with quiet precision, a motion so clean it might have come from a lifetime of drills. And maybe it had. Linda Monroe felt something tighten inside her chest. Not fear. Not even awe. Something older. Something more sacred. She watched them move, and for a moment, the graduation ceremony disappeared. The stage blurred. The lights dimmed. All that remained were these 6 men standing beside a 7th who had refused to move for all the right reasons. Raymond hadn't turned his head when the first chair scraped. He hadn't looked behind him when the second man stood. But now, as the 6 formed a line beside him, he slowly shifted his eyes to the left, then to the right, then back forward again. He didn't say thank you. He didn't nod. But his jaw tightened in quiet understanding. The security guard who had been monitoring the situation stopped mid-step. The usher, clipboard in hand, stood frozen, her lips parted in half-formed objection. Neither moved forward. The badges had said more than they ever could. These weren't agitators. These weren't family members stepping out of line. These were warriors. Decorated. Disciplined. Deadly if necessary. And they had drawn an invisible circle around Raymond Cole that no one in that room had the authority to cross. The man in the cap stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but filled with something unshakable. "This man doesn't leave this room," he said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word landed like a drumbeat. "He led us through hell. He stays right here." A murmur moved through the rows like wind through leaves. Some in the audience gasped quietly. Others sat straighter, suddenly unsure of what they were witnessing. The usher took a step back, her confidence unraveling beneath the weight of what she could no longer deny. The security guard lowered his hand, no longer reaching for the radio at his shoulder. Authority had shifted in the room, not violently, but absolutely. Raymond lowered his eyes, just for a second. Not in submission. In humility. These men had not been summoned. They had not been asked. And yet, when they saw that he had been pushed aside, they had moved. Not for recognition. Not for show. They moved because once, long ago, he had done the same for them. Linda stood up. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't draw attention. But when she rose from her chair, she felt the shift move with her. The woman beside her looked up in confusion, then down at the floor, unsure of whether she should do the same. Linda didn't look at her. Her eyes were on Raymond. The silence that followed was thick, not with tension, but with clarity. The kind of silence that arrives when something sacred has entered a room and no one wants to disturb it. The dean, halfway through reading another name, paused slightly, uncertain of why the room had changed. He glanced up from the podium, then over the heads of the audience, toward the back of the auditorium. He squinted, confused, then frowned slightly as if processing something unexpected. The applause that had followed the last name now faded into something quieter, something not quite applause and not quite reverence. It was a space held open by truth, and truth didn't need noise. Raymond remained still, the card still in his hand, the creases now barely holding together. His shoulders relaxed the slightest degree, not because he had won, but because someone else had finally seen what was happening. Not the room. Not the faculty. But the men who knew what it meant to be forgotten after the hardest fights. One of the seals placed a hand gently on Raymond's shoulder. Just one tap, firm and brotherly. It said everything. It said, "We see you. We remember. We follow still." Raymond gave the smallest nod in return. That was enough. Linda looked back toward the stage. The ceremony continued, but something had shifted. The ritual was no longer the focus. Now, there was a deeper story unfolding. A story not written in the program. A story that had stood quietly at the back of the room, waiting to be recognized. Raymond never asked for this. He had never raised his voice, never held up his card like a demand. He had stood in silence because that was how he had lived. Not to be invisible. But because he knew that dignity didn't shout. And now, 6 men had drawn a line in that silence. And the world, finally, had begun to listen. The room held its breath. The moment, though unspoken, had become larger than the stage, larger than the program, larger than the neat structure of the ceremony itself. For a long pause, no one moved, and no one dared fill the silence that had settled like a solemn fog over the crowd. 6 men stood in a half-arc beside Raymond Cole, forming not a wall of defiance but of remembrance. Raymond, in his weather-dress blues and scuffed boots, had not spoken more than a few sentences since entering the building. Yet in this moment, surrounded by the men he had once led, he didn't need to speak at all. His presence filled the room more powerfully than any speech that podium had ever seen. The security guard who had approached earlier remained near the edge of the wall, no longer advancing. His posture was stiff, uncertain, as if waiting for instructions that no longer applied. The usher who had once stood between Raymond and the front row had backed up, her eyes no longer firm with protocol but wide with something between shame and disbelief. They had tried to remove a man who had once stood between death and the very freedom they celebrated today. They had pointed him to the back of the room as if he were a problem to be solved, not a story to be honored. Raymond's eyes were steady. He didn't look at the people who now turned in their seats. He didn't acknowledge the whispers growing in volume. He stared straight ahead, the card from Lucas still resting in his hand like an oath too sacred to fold again. He thought not of being vindicated but of being seen. It was never about forcing a place for himself. It was about fulfilling a promise. And the only person whose eyes he wanted to meet hadn't yet walked across that stage. Linda Monroe remained standing, her hands clasped before her like someone attending a funeral for a man still living. She didn't know Raymond Cole's history, not in detail, but she knew enough now to feel the injustice like a weight in her throat. She had watched him be dismissed without so much as a name, pushed aside by policies too rigid to recognize a living legacy. And she had watched, heart pounding, as 6 warriors stood and reclaimed that dignity for him with nothing more than their silence. The dean, who had resumed speaking from the stage, paused again. He looked toward the disturbance in the crowd, his polished demeanor faltering just slightly. It was clear he didn't know exactly what was happening, only that something had interrupted the flow of the event in a way he could not ignore. His eyes scanned the audience and landed briefly on the aisle, where 6 men stood at attention beside a 7th who had not moved since arriving. The dean hesitated. His voice faltered. And for a fraction of a second, he realized that he had failed to see something he should have recognized the moment that man walked through the door. Still, Raymond said nothing. He was not here for acknowledgement. He had not come for the applause. He had not come to collect gratitude. He had come for one reason only, to see his son. And he would stand for as long as it took. One of the SEALs stepped forward, the tall one who had spoken first. His voice, when it returned, was calm and steady, but it carried through the auditorium like a command. "You can't remove him," he said. "You won't." The dean shifted behind the podium, clearing his throat as if to respond, but the man continued. "This man led us through fire, through blood, through days where no one expected to survive. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. When everything fell apart, he stood in the middle and brought us back. He doesn't belong at the back of this room. He belongs wherever he chooses to stand." Another wave of murmurs passed through the audience. People who had previously looked away now turned to see Raymond more clearly. There were no medals on his chest today. No honors pinned to his coat. But he stood like a man who had earned every inch of ground beneath his feet. Slowly, heads began to nod. A few people shifted in their seats. Linda watched the faces around her change. What began as confusion was turning into understanding, and understanding into something deeper. From the left side of the auditorium, another voice rose. It was not loud, but it was firm. It belonged to an older man, silver-haired, dressed in a blazer pinned with military medals that gleamed under the auditorium lights. He stood slowly, adjusting his frame like he was unearthing strength stored away for years. "I know that man," he said. "His name is Master Sergeant Raymond Cole. 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, United States Marine Corps. Retired." The room quieted to hear him. In 2006, the man continued, "During Operation Fire Watch in Kandahar, I watched that man run back into a burning compound under active enemy fire to pull out 5 Marines who were trapped inside. He didn't wait for backup. He didn't ask for permission. He just went." The man paused, emotion tightening his throat. He was the only one who came back out alive. And he was carrying the rest of us on his back. Gasps followed. One person dropped their program. Someone else muttered, "Oh my God." Linda's hand rose slowly to her mouth. She looked back at Raymond. He hadn't moved. He didn't react. His eyes still watched the stage. Not for praise. Not for recognition. For Lucas. The colonel remained standing, his voice resolute. "You don't escort that man out. You escort him to the front." Raymond's shoulders, which had been locked in place for nearly 2 hours, eased just slightly. Not with pride. But with the knowledge that someone had remembered. Someone had spoken his name not as a whisper but as a banner. For the first time, the dean stepped away from the microphone and walked to the edge of the stage. He looked out at the crowd, then back at the man beneath the exit sign, flanked by 6 warriors who had chosen silence until the moment demanded more. The dean did not speak. He simply nodded once, as if to say, "We were wrong." Raymond still didn't move. He didn't have to. The silence had spoken for him. The line had already been drawn. And this time, no one dared cross it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The silence in the auditorium felt like a held breath, as if the entire room had paused mid-sentence and didn't quite know how to continue. The stage lights no longer felt like the center of the story. For the last several minutes, all attention had shifted away from the formal ceremony and settled instead on a man who hadn't moved from beneath the red exit sign. A man who didn't belong in the margins. A man whose story had just been pulled into the light by the quiet authority of a retired colonel whose voice trembled only with memory. The colonel stood tall despite his age, his medals glinting with every breath. He had not spoken for applause, and yet his words had shifted the very fabric of the room. He had not come to steal focus, and yet the focus had found him. And in doing so, it had found Raymond Cole. Raymond still hadn't moved. The card from Lucas remained in his hand, the edges now barely holding together, the center crease almost transparent from the number of times it had been folded and unfolded. But for the first time since he entered the building, he felt something stir around him, not hostility, not suspicion, not scrutiny, but the beginning of understanding. Still, he kept his posture. There was no pride in his stance, no triumph in his silence. Only patience. Only the worn strength of a man who had long since accepted that the world didn't always notice the quiet ones until they refused to fall. The dean lingered near the edge of the stage, visibly unsettled. He glanced at his program as if searching for a protocol that would allow him to recover the ceremony's dignity. But dignity wasn't on the stage anymore. It had walked through the side door an hour earlier in scuffed boots and an old marine jacket. The colonel's voice returned, softer now. That man didn't just fight. He didn't just serve. He carried his men, literally carried them, through fire. When the rest of us were trapped in that compound, and the smoke was so thick we couldn't breathe, he broke through a back wall with his bare hands. He hauled us out one at a time, bullets flying, the air so hot it blistered our skin. He didn't check for orders. He didn't wait for clearance. He just moved. Linda Monroe sat breathless in her seat. She had no personal ties to the military. She had taught English for 23 years, raised 2 boys on her own, and seen her fair share of students come and go through that very college. But nothing she had read in a book, nothing she had underlined or taught, had moved her quite like what she was witnessing now. It was one thing to talk about courage. It was another thing entirely to see it standing 10 feet from you, silent and uncelebrated it. The colonel's hand trembled slightly as he continued. He came back for all 5 of us. And he didn't even take credit. I put him in for a medal that never arrived. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because no one followed up. We went home. Some of us quit. Some of us drank. Some of us tried to forget. But he went quiet. Back to civilian life. Back to fatherhood. Back to a world that didn't know what it owed him. The pause that followed those words was deafening. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. Raymond closed his eyes for a brief second. Not to hide emotion, but to steady the room spinning behind the weight of memory. Fire watch. That operation had carved itself into his bones. He still dreamed about the screams echoing through smoke, the crack of metal tearing from heat, the way his own hands bled when he dragged Corporal Hastings through a collapsed hallway. And how, in the end, only one of the 5 ever spoke to him again. The others moved on. Or didn't. He had never needed thanks. Never chased medals. All he wanted was to raise his son away from that world. Lucas had been just a boy then, wide-eyed and full of questions. Raymond had never given him answers. Not about war. Not about what men were capable of when the sky went red. He had only told him to stand tall, stay honest, and be someone he'd be proud to look in the eye. Lucas had listened. And now, Raymond was standing here, not because he wanted to be noticed, but because his son had asked him to. The card had said everything. "I want you in the front row." That line had brought him farther than any deployment ever had. It was a mission of a different kind. One rooted not in survival, but in love. The audience began to shift. No longer just watching. They were feeling it too. Some lowered their heads in silent acknowledgement. A few wiped at their eyes. Even the polished guests in the front row sat straighter now, their expressions softened from skepticism to understanding. Something sacred had entered the room, earned, not declared. One of the seals beside Raymond cleared his throat softly. He was younger than the rest, early 30s perhaps, but his stance betrayed no uncertainty. He stepped slightly forward, addressing the colonel. "Sir," he said with quiet respect, "thank you for telling them what we all knew." He never would have said it himself. The colonel nodded once and sat slowly, every movement careful but deliberate. His part was done. The room took a collective breath. Raymond opened his eyes again. His gaze was calm, focused, and undistracted. He wasn't looking for applause. He was waiting. Waiting for the name that mattered. The one that would bring the mission to completion. Lucas Cole. That name was coming. And now, the room knew why it mattered. The next name was called from the stage, followed by another polite round of applause, but it felt hollow now, as if the ceremony was clinging to formality only because it didn't know what else to do. For a few more moments, the dean's voice carried across the room with forced steadiness, but his cadence had changed, like a man reading through a script that no longer belonged to him. The auditorium had become something else entirely, a place no longer defined by academic honor or social placement but by a still, commanding truth standing at the back of the room in a worn uniform beside 6 silent sentinels. Raymond didn't move. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers that still trickled through the crowd like uncertain currents. But he remained rooted, as still and unmoved as when he'd first been told to step back. The card in his hand was damp now at the edges, warmed by the skin of his palm and the weight of time. He stared at the stage without blinking, every nerve in his body listening for one name, just one, the only one that mattered. The only reason he was here. His muscles were rigid from standing. His shoulder ached the way it always did after long hours, the old injury reminding him of the sand, the heat, and the firestorm that had nearly ended it all. But the pain wasn't unwelcome. It grounded him. And then it happened. The speaker returned to the microphone, this time not the dean but a student volunteer, his voice younger, untested. There was a pause, then a clearing of the throat. "And now," he said, representing the Department of Sociology, Lucas James Cole. The name rang through the room like a bell struck in the hollow of a cathedral. Not loud, but absolute. Raymond's heart stuttered once before finding its rhythm again. On the stage, a tall young man with dark curls under a mortarboard stepped forward from the back line. His gown shifted around his ankles as he walked with a steady pace toward the microphone. The usual applause came slowly at first, scattered, then built as more hands joined in. But it wasn't raucous. It was reverent. Raymond saw him now, his boy, the same boy who once waited on the porch every evening he was deployed, who fell asleep curled next to his boots, who once drew him a picture of Dad and me on the moon and left it folded in his rucksack. He watched Lucas walk to the center of the stage and stop, not to shake hands or collect his diploma, but to face the audience. Then Lucas did something no one expected. He stepped away from the line. He turned toward the microphone and leaned forward. The crowd began to shift again, a rustling of fabric and confusion. The volunteer beside him whispered something, likely reminding him of protocol. Lucas didn't respond. His hand gripped the sides of the podium. His lips trembled, just once, then stilled. "My name is Lucas Cole," he said, his voice louder than it should have been, clear and unscripted. I know I'm supposed to just say thank you, shake a hand, and keep moving. But if you'll let me, I need to say something else first. The room froze. I'm proud of this day, Lucas said, his breath short, the microphone catching the weight behind each word. I'm proud of the degree I've earned, of the people who helped me get here. But none of that means anything, not really, if I don't say this now. He looked out into the crowd. Not at the front rows. Not at the camera. He looked toward the back of the room. That man standing near the wall, he said, his voice cracking just slightly. That's my father. Whispers surged again like a tide breaking against the shore. He's not just my father, Lucas continued. He's my hero. He's my example. He's the reason I learned how to get back up every time life knocked me down. And when I told him I wanted him in the front row, I meant it. Because no matter who sat here in these chairs, donors, faculty, friends, he's the one who earned that seat 1,000 times over. Not just for what he did overseas, but for what he did every day since. For showing up when it was hard. For staying when others walked away. For raising me with nothing but love and sacrifice and honor. Raymond's eyes didn't blink. But something changed behind them, the faint shimmer of a tear that never quite reached the surface. He never wanted attention, Lucas said. He didn't come here to be seen. He just came because I asked him to. Because I needed him to. And if I stood here today and said nothing, if I accepted this diploma while he stood at the back of the room like he didn't belong, then I would have failed him. And I won't do that. The audience had fallen into a silence so complete it was almost spiritual. So, Lucas said, stepping from the podium now, his gown sweeping behind him, I'm not walking across that stage until I've walked to him first. The student volunteer tried to gesture him back, but Lucas was already descending the stairs. One foot, then the other, steady, sure, his eyes locked on the man who had never once wavered. The crowd parted without being asked. Students moved. Parents stood. Raymond stood taller, if that were even possible. And when Lucas finally reached him, he didn't hesitate. He stopped right in front of his father, pulled himself upright, and raised his hand in a sharp, clean salute. It was the salute of a man honoring another not because of rank, but because of reverence. Raymond didn't return the salute. He stepped forward and pulled his son into his arms. There was no performance in that embrace. No grand gesture. Just a father and a son holding on to each other with the quiet weight of all the years, all the distance, all the truths they never needed to speak aloud. And around them, in complete silence, the 6 seals at Raymond's side all raised their hands. And saluted. The moment Lucas brought his hand to his brow and saluted his father, the entire auditorium froze. The motion was so unexpected, so solemn, and so pure that no one dared breathe. Even the stage light seemed to hesitate, casting a soft golden sheen over the 2 figures at the back of the room as if reluctant to interrupt. The air was no longer filled with ceremony or tradition, it was thick with something sacred, a reverence that didn't come from doctrine or rank but from truth. And when Raymond stepped forward, breaking decades of restraint, and wrapped his arms around his son, the room crossed an invisible line. From that point forward, no one would remember this day for diplomas or degrees. They would remember it for this. Lucas didn't speak. He didn't need to. His face was pressed into his father's shoulder, his hands clutching the folds of that worn marine jacket like a lifeline. And Raymond? He simply held his son, one hand firm behind Lucas's back, the other still gripping the card. The crease down the middle had almost torn through now, but he kept it close, crumpled between his fingers and his son's spine, as though trying to fuse the words permanently into the moment. He didn't shake. He didn't cry. But his breathing deepened, and for the first time that day, his head dipped, not in shame, not in defeat, but in relief. Behind them, the 6 seals stood straighter. Each one had faced death beside Raymond Cole, Each one had trusted him with their lives in places where names disappeared into radio static and promises were made in blood. They had watched him defy orders to save them, to lead them out of chaos and into light. And now they stood in his shadow again, not to protect him, but to witness him. Their salutes held firm as Lucas stepped back from the embrace, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his gown, his expression filled with gratitude and pride so fierce it seemed to light his entire face. He looked around the room. His classmates. The faculty. The administration. The families who had clapped for speeches and applauded honor cords now sat frozen in something deeper than respect. They were beginning to understand what they had almost missed entirely. He took his father's hand, not to lead, but to walk beside him. Their steps were slow, their pace deliberate, but every footfall echoed like a drumbeat. The crowd shifted without being told. People in the aisles moved. Parents stood. Heads bowed. A path cleared on its own, as though the universe had remembered what was right and moved everything else out of the way. Linda Monroe stood motionless, her hands pressed against her chest, eyes brimming with emotion she hadn't prepared for. She had seen many students honored. She had heard countless speeches about perseverance and legacy and leadership. But this was different. This was leadership without a podium. This was legacy written in sacrifice, not scholarships. She watched as Raymond and Lucas moved slowly toward the front, the 6 seals falling in step behind them like a detail guarding something precious. No one stopped them. No one dared. They passed row after row of once indifferent faces, and those same faces now looked upon them with something like awe. The woman with the headset who had blocked Raymond earlier stood near the edge of the aisle, her clipboard trembling in her hands. She didn't meet his gaze. She looked down at her shoes as they passed. She had misjudged him, not just once, but completely. The usher who had tried to remove him earlier was nowhere in sight. Raymond didn't scan the room. He kept his eyes forward. His body ached, his shoulder throbbed, and his feet burned from standing too long, but none of it mattered. He was walking beside his son. That was the only destination that had ever mattered. When they reached the front, the velvet rope that had once barred him felt like nothing more than a strip of ribbon across a forgotten door. One of the seals leaned forward and lifted it aside, and the 2 men stepped through, not as intruders, but as rightful guests. They walked to the second row, center left, exactly where Lucas had asked him to sit. The seat had been empty all along. Raymond paused beside it. He didn't look to anyone for permission. He simply waited. The moment held still. Then, without a word, the usher who had stood near the aisle earlier stepped aside, her hand trembling as she gestured toward the chair. She didn't speak. She didn't apologize. But she moved out of the way. Raymond nodded once and sat. Lucas remained standing for a moment, looking down at his father with a smile that came from the deepest place in his being. Then he sat beside him, their shoulders touching, their bond solidified not by blood alone but by every test it had survived. Behind them, the seals remained standing, arms folded at their backs, their expressions unreadable but their eyes vigilant. They would not return to their seats. Not until the room remembered who it had almost forgotten. The dean stepped back to the podium, his notes still clutched in his hands. But he didn't look at them. He looked out at the crowd, at the man in the second row, and then at the young graduate who had left the stage not to receive but to return. He swallowed and adjusted the microphone. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its polish. It was smaller now, quieter, touched by something heavier. "We are honored today," he said slowly, "to welcome guests of great distinction. Some we recognized too late. And some we nearly didn't recognize at all." There was a pause. A beat of silence. Then, from somewhere in the middle rows, one pair of hands began to clap. Slow. Steady. Another joined in. Then another. Like a rainfall beginning with one drop, the sound grew until the entire auditorium was on its feet. No one cheered. There were no whoops or hollers. Just applause. Raw. Unmistakable. Reverent. Raymond didn't stand. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't turn around. He sat in the front row as his son had asked him to, the card now pressed to his heart inside his jacket. He closed his eyes for just a moment, and in that stillness, allowed the sound to pass through him like breath. He hadn't come for this. He had come for his son. And yet now the entire room stood for him. Not because he demanded it. But because they owed it. The applause rolled through the auditorium like a wave that no one wanted to end. It was not the kind of clapping that followed a clever speech or a ceremonial cue. It had no rhythm, no rehearsed beginning or end. It was human and raw and unfiltered, coming from a place deeper than politeness. Some clapped with both hands pressed tight, others with palms trembling, a few with tears streaking their cheeks. But they all clapped. And they all stood. Slowly at first, then all at once, every person in the auditorium, students, faculty, parents, guests, rose to their feet. They weren't rising for the degree. They weren't rising for the institution. They were rising for the man in the second row who had been denied a seat until the entire room realized they had denied something sacred. Raymond Cole sat still. He did not acknowledge the applause. He did not raise his hand or place it over his heart. He didn't nod or smile. He simply looked forward, his son beside him, the folded card resting once again in his breast pocket, close enough to feel with every breath. It wasn't pride in his eyes. It was peace. A quiet, steady peace that came not from being honored, but from seeing the world turn itself right again, if only for one moment. Lucas glanced at his father, his lips parting slightly, a question forming in his eyes. But Raymond only shook his head, once, slowly. Not now. Not yet. Let the moment settle. Let it belong to the room. Lucas sat back, understanding. His heart swelled with 100 emotions all colliding at once. He had hoped, when he wrote that card weeks ago, that his father would feel seen. What he hadn't expected was that the whole world would see him too. The dean remained behind the podium, unsure of what to say next. He looked down at his prepared remarks, then folded the paper quietly in half and set it aside. It no longer mattered. Whatever he had planned could not carry the weight of what had already been said by silence, by presence, by standing men in civilian clothes who bore invisible scars. His voice, when it returned, was subdued. Some guests, he said, don't come to be noticed. They come because someone they love asked them to be here. They come carrying memories we can't see. They come hoping simply to witness the next chapter. He paused, his eyes meeting Raymond's for the first time. And sometimes, he added, the next chapter doesn't begin until we notice them. A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. Heads nodded. Hands pressed together again in another quiet wave of applause. The dean stepped back and motioned for the next name to be called. But something had shifted permanently. The energy of the room, once rigid and formal, had softened, transformed. The ceremony resumed, but it was no longer a recital. It was a shared experience, one that would be remembered long after the diplomas were filed away and the chairs folded back into storage. Raymond shifted slightly in his seat, rolling his left shoulder, the familiar ache spreading down his arm. He had been still for so long that the movement sent a quiet jolt through his nerves. But he didn't complain. He never had. Every pain in his body had a name, a face, a memory. They were with him always. And now, they had watched this moment too. Behind him, the 6 seals remained standing. They hadn't returned to their seats. Their job wasn't to sit. It was to bear witness. Their hands now rested quietly behind their backs, their chins lifted. Their eyes were forward, not on the stage, but on the man who had once led them through the worst days of their lives and now sat, for the first time in years, where he belonged. Linda Monroe finally sat down, her legs trembling slightly. She wiped at the corners of her eyes, her program still gripped in her lap. She didn't know what she would say when people asked her about today. But she knew what she wouldn't forget. She wouldn't forget the sound of chairs scraping. She wouldn't forget the salute. She wouldn't forget how a man who was told he didn't belong had become the center of everything. The ceremony continued, name after name, applause after applause, but each clap now carried something extra. A little more sincerity. A little more gratitude. A little more humility. Some graduates, as they descended from the stage, made their way toward Raymond's row, casting brief, uncertain glances his way. A few nodded. One young woman placed her hand briefly on his shoulder and whispered something too soft to hear. He didn't answer. But his presence answered for him. Near the end of the ceremony, a girl with tear-streaked cheeks, her mortarboard crooked and her heels in her hand, stood before him. She had not spoken during the ceremony, had not drawn attention. But now she paused, squared her shoulders, and saluted. "Thank you for carrying them," she said. Raymond looked up at her, his lips parting but no words coming out. Instead, he nodded. A deep, slow nod that reached her heart more than 1,000 speeches ever could. And then she was gone, blending back into the sea of gowns and garlands and new beginnings. Lucas leaned close and whispered, "They're starting to get it, Dad." Raymond exhaled. They were never supposed to. But maybe it's better this way. The final name was called. The crowd erupted one last time. The graduates tossed their caps, the music rose, and the camera flashes returned. But even through all of it, the center of gravity had shifted. It no longer belonged to the stage or the podium. It belonged to the second row, where a quiet man sat beside his son, having said almost nothing at all, and having spoken louder than anyone ever could. The ceremony ended, but no one rushed to leave. The music played, the students hugged, and families weaved between rows of chairs to find their graduates. But around Raymond Cole, space remained. It wasn't a distance of exclusion now, it was respect. Like an unspoken circle carved around someone the world had nearly forgotten but now held in collective awe. Raymond stood slowly, his knees stiff from the long sit, and adjusted the collar of his jacket. Lucas remained beside him, watching, waiting. The crowd swirled like a tide around them, but they stayed still, anchored. A few of the seals drifted in quietly. One of them, a thick-shouldered man named Reese, gave Raymond a subtle nod and reached out to clasp his shoulder. "You good, sir?" he asked, voice low. Raymond nodded once. "I'm good." Reese smiled, though it was more in his eyes than his mouth. "You always were. Even when everything else was burning." Another seal approached, younger, leaner, with a tight buzz cut and eyes that had seen too much. "You made them see it," he said to Raymond. "All of them. Took years, but today, they saw you." "I didn't need them to," Raymond replied quietly. "Just needed Lucas to." Lucas turned toward his father then, a new kind of look in his eyes, not the look of a boy seeking approval, but the look of a man seeing his father clearly for the first time, not just as a parent but as a warrior who had carried mountains without ever speaking of the weight. "I did," he said. "I see it. All of it." The crowd began to shift toward the exits. Laughter returned in bursts. Parents with cameras tried to gather their families, professors in robes shared quick handshakes and goodbyes, and the bright afternoon sun outside beckoned with promises of celebration. But inside the hall, Raymond lingered. He looked up at the stage one last time, remembering a lifetime's worth of moments in the span of a breath. Not his name being called, his had never been spoken on stages, but the names he had carried. Names that lived in silence. In scars. In memory. Lucas tugged gently at his sleeve. "Come on, Dad. Let's walk." They moved together, a slow steady walk up the center aisle, with the seals flanking quietly behind. The murmurs followed them again, not hostile this time but reverent, curious, moved. Linda Monroe saw them coming and stepped aside with a hand to her heart. As they passed, she whispered, "Thank you for your service," and Raymond gave her a nod, not out of obligation but of mutual understanding. She didn't say it for recognition. She said it because she finally understood what it meant. Outside, the sun poured across the lawn, the heat clinging to the backs of their necks, and students flooded into the open space with caps flying, tassels tangled, and gowns flapping in the breeze. But when Raymond stepped onto the sidewalk, it felt different from when he had entered. He was no longer a shadow at the edges. He was a man the world had seen, and chosen not to look away from. A boy nearby asked his father, "Who is he?" And the man leaned down and said softly, "That's a real hero, son. That's what one looks like." Raymond heard it. He didn't turn. But something in his chest shifted, settled. He walked beside Lucas, whose gown flapped slightly with each step, and they made their way across the grass toward a quiet bench near the edge of the quad. The 6 seals followed but stopped short, forming a loose perimeter, giving them space. This wasn't their moment. This was Raymond's. He sat slowly, the wooden bench creaking beneath him, and Lucas sat beside him, pulling off his cap and letting out a long, slow breath. "I didn't know if you'd come," Lucas said. "Not after the way they treated you at first." "I wasn't there for them," Raymond replied. "I was there for you." Lucas looked down at his hands, then at the sky. "It meant more than I can ever explain." Raymond smiled, just a touch. "You don't need to explain. You showed me." They sat in silence for a while, watching the swirl of joy around them, listening to the waves of laughter and camera clicks and the shouts of reuniting families. But they were apart from it now, in a world quieter and more honest. Lucas reached into the fold of his gown and pulled out the small medal that had been mailed to him months earlier, a replica honor coin he had ordered himself, meant as a simple gesture, something symbolic. He turned it over in his fingers. "This was supposed to be for you," he said. "I meant to give it to you on stage. It was going to be my surprise." Raymond took it gently, his fingers brushing over the engraved lines. It wasn't military issue, but it carried weight. More than the coin itself, it carried intention. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," Lucas said. "Because I wanted you to know that the world might have forgotten for a while, but I never did." Raymond turned the coin again, reading the inscription on the back. "To the man who led in silence." He closed his hand over it. "You didn't have to remind me who I am, son. You just had to let me see who you've become." Lucas looked at him, tears threatening again, but held back by the strength that ran in their blood. "Then I guess we're even." "No," Raymond said quietly. "We're just getting started." They sat together, father and son, 2 generations joined by more than blood. Around them, the world spun with its usual chaos, but in that quiet corner of the campus, something eternal had happened. Not a ceremony. Not a speech. But a revelation. And as the crowd thinned and the shadows stretched across the green, one seal approached with a camera and held it up. "Sir," he said, nodding to Raymond, "mind if I take one?" Raymond looked to Lucas. Lucas smiled. "Go ahead," Raymond said. The shutter clicked once. A father and son. A bench in the sun. A new chapter, captured in light. As the sun began its slow descent behind the brick buildings of the campus, casting golden streaks across the well-trimmed lawn, Raymond and Lucas sat quietly on the bench, the crowd gradually dissolving into scattered conversations and distant music. The tension from earlier in the day had drained from Raymond's body, leaving behind an unfamiliar lightness, like a man walking out from under years of invisible weight. He had not come to be seen, but he had been. And what mattered more, he had been seen by the one person who carried his name forward. Lucas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the black robe draping around his shoulders like armor. "You know," he said softly, I was afraid you'd leave after they stopped you from sitting down. Raymond didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the horizon where the line of families moved toward parking lots, balloons bounced against car windows, and laughter echoed like confetti in the air. He watched them not with envy, but with distance, like a man observing a language he once spoke fluently but now simply understood in silence. I thought about it, he finally said. I thought about walking right out the doors and disappearing like I've done before. There were years I made myself invisible just to keep the peace. Lucas's eyes tightened. You shouldn't have to. Raymond turned toward him, his gaze clear. Maybe not. But sometimes we do what we think will keep the world from breaking in the wrong places. Not because we're weak, but because we know the cost of confrontation. Lucas nodded slowly, thinking back to all the times he'd wondered why his father never demanded recognition. Why he never told his stories, never wore his medals, never corrected those who underestimated him. He thought it was humility. Now he understood it had been more than that. It had been protection. But today, Raymond continued, you asked me not to disappear. You asked me to show up. And when the moment came, I wasn't sure I could stay. But then I looked up, and I saw you waiting. Lucas turned to his father fully. And what did you see? Raymond smiled faintly. I saw the reason I ever made it home. There was a long silence between them. A comfortable silence. The kind only built through shared history, pain, and love that had weathered both. I wrote that card 3 times, Lucas said, reaching again into his pocket and pulling out the wrinkled envelope he had originally intended to place on Raymond's seat. First draft was angry. Second was apologetic. This one just told the truth. Raymond took the envelope gently, though he didn't open it. You don't need to read it to me, Lucas said quickly. I think you already knew every word. Raymond slid the card into the inner pocket of his jacket. Sometimes, hearing it matters more than knowing it. A breeze picked up, rustling the leaves in the high oaks around the courtyard. Students wandered past in clusters, a few of them still whispering about the man in the jacket and the young man who had saluted him on stage. Some stopped and stared discreetly, not daring to interrupt, but knowing they'd witnessed something deeper than a graduation. And as the sun dipped lower, a few professors came out from the auditorium, their robes billowing behind them, their expressions unreadable. Among them was a man with a silver beard and wire-rimmed glasses who approached the bench with careful steps. Mr. Cole, the professor said, extending a hand, I'm Dr. Hensley. I had the pleasure of teaching your son these last 2 years. I just wanted to thank you for what you gave this country, and what you've given this campus today. Raymond stood to shake his hand. My son gave this campus something too. Yes, Dr. Hensley said thoughtfully. He gave it perspective. After the professor left, Lucas laughed quietly. If you stay out here any longer, you're going to have your own lecture series. Raymond raised an eyebrow. Hope they don't expect me to speak. I did enough talking with silence today. Lucas stood beside him, brushing off his gown. Then let's take a walk before the moment gets turned into someone else's memory. They walked side by side toward the far end of campus, toward the old memorial courtyard where the university honored students and alumni who had served in the military. It was a quiet place, rarely visited during celebrations, surrounded by stone walls and a fountain that trickled steadily. A bronze plaque listed names of those who never returned. Raymond read them slowly, tracing his fingers along the etched letters, some familiar, some unknown, all sacred. Lucas watched his father, unsure whether to speak. But Raymond did, his voice low. Places like this, they remind you what silence really sounds like. Not the silence of exclusion, but of memory. Of sacrifice. He stepped back from the wall and looked at Lucas. You gave me something today I never expected. You gave it to me first, Lucas said. I just gave it back. They sat again, this time on the edge of the fountain. The sound of water filled the space between them. For the first time, Raymond looked tired, not from age, but from the emotional weight of a day that cracked open a vault of old scars and unspoken truths. "You've always had a seat, Dad," Lucas said. "They just didn't know it." "But I did. I always did." Raymond nodded. "And now, they can't pretend they don't." As twilight settled in and the stars began to prick the sky above, Lucas reached into his satchel and pulled out something else, a small frame, with a photo he had kept hidden until now. It was of Raymond in uniform, years younger, holding a tiny Lucas in his arms outside a hospital tent, sand caked in his boots, but his smile unmistakable. "I brought this today," Lucas said. "In case you didn't show. I needed to remember what I was fighting for." Raymond took the photo, his hand trembling just slightly. He stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "You were always worth showing up for." And in that sacred, quiet place, where names whispered through stone and memory flowed like water, Raymond Cole understood something he hadn't known for sure until that moment: he no longer had to fight to be seen. His place had always been earned. And now, finally, the world had taken its hands off the chair that was his by right. The next morning, the sun crept up behind the hills with the quiet grace of a new beginning, casting a warm amber light through the half-drawn curtains of the modest motel room Raymond had booked for the night. Lucas was still asleep in the other bed, his graduation cap hanging from the corner of the lampshade like a flag planted after a long battle. The silence was calm, not empty, a silence earned, not imposed. Raymond sat at the small table by the window, sipping black coffee from a styrofoam cup, the photo Lucas had given him the night before propped against a small Bible. He stared at it as if still searching for the man in that uniform, the younger version of himself with arms full of life and a horizon still waiting to be shaped. The events of the previous day ran through his mind in slow, deliberate pieces. The guards who tried to push him aside, the SEALs who stood by his side, the colonel who gave him back his story, and the strangers who stood for him without knowing his full name. He had shown up out of love for his son. He had stayed because that love demanded it. But the effect it left behind was beginning to ripple far beyond that auditorium. There was a knock at the door. Quiet, almost hesitant. Raymond stood and opened it, revealing Reese, one of the SEALs from the ceremony. He wore jeans and a weathered military cap, and in his hand was a folded piece of paper. "Morning, sir," Reese said. "Didn't mean to wake you if you were resting." "I've rested enough for a lifetime," Raymond replied with a slight grin and stepped back to let him in. Reese handed over the paper. "Thought you'd want to see this before it spreads too far." Raymond unfolded it. It was a printed article from the local news outlet, already posted online. A photo from the ceremony, the moment he stood beside Lucas, 6 SEALs standing at attention behind him. The headline read, "Veteran silenced at graduation, until a room rose for him." Raymond scanned the article. Quotes from the colonel. Reactions from students and faculty. Even a comment from Dean Halbert, now carefully measured, talking about the power of recognition and the importance of honoring unseen service. There was no mention of the guards by name, only a general reference to a misunderstanding. But the tone had changed. The narrative was clear. Raymond Cole was no longer the man turned away at the door, he was the man the room stood for. "They want to interview you," Reese said. "Local station, maybe national if it picks up steam." Raymond shook his head. "I didn't do this for cameras." "I know," Reese replied, lowering his voice. "But stories like yours, they heal people, sir. The ones who served and came home to silence. The ones who still carry things nobody sees. You didn't ask for a stage, but you stood on one anyway. Now it's echoing." Raymond folded the paper and set it down on the table. "What I did over there, I didn't do for thanks. And what I did yesterday, I did for my son. If the world wants to talk about it, fine. But I'm not putting on a suit to explain what should already be understood." Reese nodded. "Understood." Lucas stirred and sat up in the bed behind them, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What's going on?" "Nothing urgent," Raymond said. "Just news catching up." Reese tipped his cap to Lucas. "You made your old man proud yesterday." Lucas grinned. "I think he flipped that around on me." After Reese left, Raymond looked back at the paper again, rereading the final paragraph where a student had been quoted anonymously. "He never asked us to see him. But now that we have, we can't unsee him." They checked out of the motel around noon and drove slowly through town. Lucas insisted on stopping by the university one last time. The campus was quieter now, students gone, families dispersed, the lawn scattered with a few stray tassels and empty water bottles. But something about it felt different, like the land itself had been marked by what had taken place. They walked together to the memorial courtyard again. Lucas brought his framed photo with him and held it for a long time, then placed it carefully beneath the wall, an unspoken tribute. Raymond said nothing, but stood with one hand on his son's shoulder, eyes distant, listening not with his ears, but with his memory. And in that moment, standing in the sun, his jacket caught the light just enough to make the edges of his old marine patch gleam. As they turned to leave, another pair of visitors entered the courtyard, a middle-aged woman and a teenage boy. She looked over, startled slightly, then approached them. "You were the man from yesterday," she said softly. Raymond nodded. "My brother served," she said. "Never made it home. I wanted to say, thank you. For reminding people that service doesn't end just because the war does." Raymond placed a hand over his heart. "I remember every name I carried. And every one I couldn't bring back." She reached into her purse and handed him a folded slip of paper. "He used to say something I think you'd appreciate." Raymond unfolded it. In handwritten ink it said, "The world forgets the quiet ones. But history is carried on their backs." He stared at it for a long time, then tucked it into the same pocket that now held Lucas's card. Back in the truck, as they pulled away from campus for the last time, Lucas turned on the radio. A newscaster was just finishing a segment. And in other news, a local veteran who was nearly denied access to his own son's graduation was honored in a powerful and unexpected way yesterday. The video, now trending nationally, shows a room rising to its feet, 6 Navy SEALs in full attention behind him. A reminder, perhaps, of the silent heroes among us. Raymond didn't smile, didn't react. He just kept driving, eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. "Looks like you're famous now," Lucas said, smirking. Raymond's response was quiet. "No, son. I'm just remembered. That's enough." 3 days later, Raymond stood at the edge of his small backyard garden, the morning dew still clinging to the leaves of collard greens and tomato vines. The air in his South Carolina town was warmer, heavier, the kind that sank into your skin and stayed. He wore the same brown work boots he'd had for nearly a decade, hands dirt-streaked and calloused, sleeves rolled up. But today wasn't about soil. It was about a different kind of planting, one that grew not from the earth, but from truth finally spoken aloud. He turned as a familiar black SUV rolled up the driveway and parked quietly. Lucas stepped out first, looking more relaxed now without the gown, the pressure, or the cameras. Behind him came Colonel Willingham, dressed in his army blues, the crisp kind reserved for events that meant something. Raymond wiped his hands on a towel hanging from the porch rail and stepped forward. "You didn't say you were bringing company," Raymond said. Lucas grinned. "Didn't want to give you a reason to disappear." Willingham approached with a folder tucked neatly beneath his arm. "Mr. Cole," he greeted, extending his hand with firm precision. "We've had a few discussions since the ceremony. I wanted to see you in person. Not in a room full of strangers. Not behind a podium. Just man to man." Raymond studied him. "You don't need to explain. I saw the look in your eyes that day. That was enough." "I still need to say something," the colonel replied. "Because a lot of people didn't. He opened the folder and pulled out a thick document with several signatures, a seal, and a single silver citation pinned to the top corner. "This isn't a medal from the Pentagon," he said. "But it is a statement from people who served with you. People who remember what you did when no one else was watching." Raymond took the folder slowly, reading the title, Post-Action Recognition Statement. Unclassified Honorary Citation for Master Gunnery Sergeant Raymond E. Cole, Ret. Inside were pages of signed statements from SEALs, Marines, and former officers who had all served alongside him during his years in Afghanistan. Each testimonial bore witness to events Raymond never talked about, acts of bravery buried beneath humility and silence. He ran his finger along the words. Words like selfless, shield, guardian, savior. One note from a SEAL simply read, "He didn't speak for medals. He bled for brothers." Raymond closed the folder carefully and handed it back. "This should be kept where others can see it." "It belongs to you," Willingham said. "But we'll make sure it's archived too. I've spoken with the National Veterans Archive. They've requested an interview, if you'd allow it. Your story deserves to be preserved." "I never cared about being remembered," Raymond said. "Only about doing right." Lucas stepped forward. "Maybe that's exactly why you need to be remembered." Raymond looked between the two men. He saw a bridge forming, one foot planted in the past, one reaching into the future. For so long he had built walls around what he carried, afraid that naming it would break him. But now, perhaps, those same walls were becoming monuments. Willingham stepped aside and motioned toward the truck. "There's one more place I'd like to take you today. If you're willing." Raymond hesitated, then gave a short nod. They drove for 30 minutes down winding country roads until they reached a veterans community center tucked beside a field of tall pine trees. Outside stood a simple wooden sign, Rayburn Hall, Veterans Resource and Outreach. But something new had been added beneath it, covered by a black cloth and tied with twine. Inside, a small group had gathered. Maybe 24 people, some in uniform, some in faded ball caps with their units embroidered above the brim, all with eyes that knew the weight of service. Reese was there. So was Angela Monroe, surprisingly. A local reporter hovered near the door, holding her mic but not daring to raise it yet. Colonel Willingham walked Raymond to the covered plaque and handed him the cord. "You don't have to pull it," he said. "But I'd be honored if you did." Raymond looked at Lucas, who stood beside him with quiet pride. Then, with a slow hand, Raymond pulled the cloth down. The plaque read, "The Raymond E. Cole Veterans Honor Seat. For the one who stood in silence so others could rise in peace." Beneath it was a mounted bronze bench, built into the courtyard, the seat already worn with the sheen of new purpose. There was no fanfare, no grand speech. Just a slow collective breath from those who understood what that bench represented. Not a trophy, but a space, earned. Raymond sat down on the bench, the metal cool under his hands, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself be still. Around him, veterans came up one by one, some shaking his hand, others placing a hand over their heart. No words. Just gestures. Powerful, sacred. Angela approached with her notebook. "Mr. Cole, I'd like to write your story in full. Your words. Your voice." He thought about it. Then simply said, "Then don't write about me. Write about the ones who didn't come home." She nodded, understanding. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the courtyard, Raymond looked at the bench, the plaque, and the people. He had walked through war, through grief, through a culture that forgot him, and a system that never saw him. But today, he sat in the open, under his own name, with dignity not handed to him, but reclaimed. The man who once stood in silence now sat in the seat no one else could take. Not because someone gave it to him, but because he had always belonged there. The ceremony ended without applause, and yet it felt louder than any standing ovation. The veterans lingered, talking in low voices, some swapping memories, others just sitting in quiet solidarity on the benches around the courtyard. Raymond stayed seated on his bench, fingers brushing over the bronze plaque that now bore his name, the metal warm from the sun and worn from the moment. His presence, once quietly endured, was now fully claimed, no longer something others questioned, but something they honored. For a man who had spent years walking through rooms without acknowledgement, the weight of this new kind of recognition pressed deeply into his soul. Lucas approached with 2 cups of coffee, one for his father, one for himself. Thought you might want the strong stuff. Veteran strength. Raymond chuckled and accepted the cup. If it tastes like old rations, I'm blaming you. Lucas grinned. I tried to get the bitterness right. They sat there for a few minutes, the scent of pine around them, birdsong peppering the air. It was peaceful, and that peace was hard-earned. Lucas broke the silence. Dad, I didn't know you still carried all of that. Everything from the war. From coming home. From being invisible. Raymond didn't answer right away. He took a sip, then looked across the courtyard, where a young Marine with a prosthetic leg was helping an older Navy vet to a chair. You never stop carrying it, son. You just learn where to set it down, piece by piece. Lucas looked down at his own hands. And this bench? Raymond nodded slowly. One piece laid to rest. After a while, a small group of ROTC students arrived, guided by a faculty advisor. They were scheduled to tour the center, but when they saw Raymond, they paused at a respectful distance. The advisor walked over. Mr. Cole, would you mind speaking to them? Even for just a few minutes. Raymond raised an eyebrow. I didn't prepare a speech. That's okay, she said. They'll hear more from you than 1,000 rehearsed lectures. He stood slowly, stretching his back before walking to where the students stood. They formed a half-circle instinctively, the kind of formation learned through training, through discipline. Raymond looked at each face, eager, uncertain, full of potential. You'll wear uniforms, he began. Some of you already do. Some of you will serve in combat. Some of you won't. But all of you will serve in a world that doesn't always know what to do with your silence. The students watched him closely. People will celebrate you when you deploy. They'll thank you at the airport. But when you come home, there may be a day you walk into a room and feel like you have to earn your seat all over again. He let the word settle. Don't let anyone make you feel smaller because they don't understand your sacrifice. Don't wait for applause to believe in your worth. And don't forget those who never got a seat at all. He paused. You don't serve for recognition. But if you serve with honor, it finds you, eventually. A long silence followed. Then, one of the students, a young black cadet, stepped forward and saluted. Not a quick, nervous gesture, but a firm, respectful salute. Thank you, Master Gunnery Sergeant. Raymond returned it with precision. Carry it forward. After the group left, Lucas walked back up beside him. You're starting to sound like a commander again. Old habits, Raymond said, though his eyes twinkled with something more than age, something close to contentment. As the afternoon wore on, more messages arrived. Emails from people across the country. Veterans who saw the article. Children of those who had served. Even a letter from a senator's office requesting a meeting about improved veteran outreach. Raymond responded to none of them immediately. He simply sat, letting it all come to him without chasing it. For once, he didn't feel the need to fight his way into the conversation. He was already part of it. Later that evening, back at home, he sat with Lucas on the porch, the two of them watching the horizon burn orange with the sunset. Lucas pulled out a small box and handed it to his father. I've been saving this. Didn't think the timing was right before. Raymond opened it. Inside was a hand-carved wooden pin in the shape of an eagle clutching an olive branch. On the back were engraved words, "For the man who led by standing still." Raymond stared at it, blinking back the emotion. You made this? Lucas nodded. And I wanted to give it to you while it still matters to both of us. Before the world tries to turn this moment into a symbol and forgets the man. Raymond held the pin in his hand, then placed it carefully beside the card from the graduation and the handwritten quote from the memorial courtyard. Each token told a different part of the same story. The next morning, Raymond rose early, as he always did, brewed his coffee, and walked out into his backyard. But instead of heading for the garden, he walked to the old barn at the back of the property. Inside, among dusty boxes and faded photographs, he found the duffel bag. The one that had sat untouched for over 20 years. He opened it, pulling out his old service jacket, the one he had worn to Lucas's graduation. Then, with deliberate care, he hung it on a clean wooden hanger and placed it in a new glass display case he had prepared. It sat beside the plaque from the center, the photo of Lucas as a baby in his arms, and the folded flag that had waited patiently for years. When he finished arranging everything, he stepped back and stared at it for a long moment. He saw the boy who had left for war, the man who had returned, the father who had stood alone, and the veteran who had finally been seen. Lucas walked in quietly behind him. You building a museum? He asked, half joking. No, Raymond said with a smile. Just putting things where they belong. Lucas nodded. Looks good. Raymond turned to him. So do you. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the tall grass. Raymond stood still, shoulders square, eyes forward, like a man ready for whatever came next. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not in the world, but in him. He was no longer the forgotten. He was the foundation. The kind of man stories are passed down from. The kind whose silence speaks louder than any trumpet, and whose presence demands not permission, but respect. The salute from the graduation still echoed in his soul. And now, finally, he knew it always would. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?